now move into HiveScience. So this will be a topic that actually I want to thank Purple. I saw Purple in here earlier. I don't know if Purple's still here or not, but you inspired today's topic because we are going to be talking about the size limits on the arthropod body and some fun ideas that people have come up with to explain this in works of fiction as well. So first and foremost, let's move into what is this is dated, of course, because we now have an arthropleura that was even bigger, but Giant Claw reveals the largest arthropod. This is from 2008, talking about what the biggest arthropod is. So the largest arthropod at the time this was written was aquatic, which it is an expectation because the largest animals, tetrapods or otherwise, have always been aquatic because buoyancy allows for the body to grow larger due to less physiological stress from the environment due to buoyancy. Jacaloteris renania from the early Devonian was about 2.5 meters long, so bigger than the average person. I hear a lot of people say it was essentially the size of an alligator, which I'm okay with that comparison. I think alligators obviously probably do get quite a bit bigger than Jacaloteris grew, but there are some species of alligators and some species of crocodilian that do max out at this body size. So I would use the example of a caiman. That's my opinion. Maybe a spectacled caiman instead of an alligator. But the arthropleura has kind of, I think they're the newest finding. That one that we did a video on previously was like 2.7 meters long, so a little bit bigger. Is now considered the largest arthropod. It's completely terrestrial, which is interesting. And that's not to say that we won't find more species of aquatic arthropods or terrestrial arthropods that are bigger. But we can understand a lot about the limitations of the size of the organisms as they move through generations, getting larger and larger. What are the constraints? What are the fallbacks? The most popular and most common one pointed out when it comes to giant arthropods is the square cube law, but also, of course, the respiratory issues. Size matters for insects. In sci-fi, there's a lot of examples in which characters are attacked by giant insects or other arthropods, or even beings transformed into one of them, as in the Metamorphosis by Kafka. But are these situations really feasible? It would be possible to find giant insects nowadays. In this article, we will introduce you to what the main biological and anatomical principles, as well as the most important hypothesis that try to explain whether it would be possible a world inhabited by giant bees, ants, and spiders. I think they might have been missing a word there. Maybe I read it wrong though. All right. Which factors limit the size of insects? Insects, and also the rest of arthropods, are considered small animals. Obviously, the term small is absolutely relative, although there does exist a species of ant as big as an elephant although there doesn't exist a species of ant as big as an elephant, at this point we can introduce the term allometry. If ants were giant, they would have elephant-like legs. Allometry, also called biological scaling, is defined as the change in organisms in relation to proportional changes in body size. It is, so to speak, a rule of proportionality. There are different meanings for this term. The ontogenetic one is the most famous definition: changes in the proportions of different body parts during the development of an organism. A human baby has a bigger head proportionate to the size of its body than an adult due to the different growth rates of each body part. It is important to add that each body part will always keep a link to the proportionality with the other ones, and this link is genetically determined. So yeah, basically like the size of the head, limbs, just all the different portions of the body compared to each other as we grow. And there's a reason, physiological constraints that drive that. In our case of study, the meaning of the term allometry is one related with a more anatomical point of view. Insects and the rest of arthropods are covered by a more or less hardened exoskeleton known as cuticle, which is periodically replaced by molting processes, or ecdysis. This cuticle implies a lot of constraints on growth for these organisms due to its heaviness, because it's biomineralized. So if an ant grows, typo here. All you need is biology by WordPress. This is like a blog, so this is someone's think piece. I just thought it was fun to read. If an ant grows to be as big as an elephant, the weight of its cuticle would be out of proportion. This fact acquires more relevance if we take into account that arthropods are invertebrate organisms, so they don't have an internal structure that makes them internally solid. Thus, the most feasible scenario would be that their legs couldn't hold their body weight. So they will collapse. In order to hold a huge weight of these cuticles, the legs must be proportionately as large as the ones in an elephant or even bigger. I don't know about that. I think that we can look at Dinosauria with their hollow bones, because diapsids are kind of in between there because they have air pockets in between their bones. So having a cylinder that's hollow can be a strong structure. I mean, solid bones are good, but some of the biggest organisms that ever lived had hollow spaces in between, and that aided them in being larger, not hindered them. So I don't know if I agree with that they have to be elephant size. They definitely have to be proportionate. So they wouldn't just look like an ant's leg now compared to his body. They would be bulkier in comparison to support that weight. Now they wouldn't, and you also have to keep in mind that they'd be supported by 6 limbs instead of just the 4 that we see in an elephant. So, and that's another case where they wouldn't necessarily be or need to be as big as an elephant's leg, because each leg is not supporting as much weight because there's more limbs. And if you get into other arthropods, we get ones that have up to 12 legs. We get into myriapods, and you've got many legs. So no, this analogy with the elephant is not really going to go one for one, due to the multiple limbs not being required in each limb to hold as much weight. So I disagree with the blog writer here. All right. Relation between growth and corporal volume and the growth of locomotor appendices. Tree of Life, master's degree in biodiversity, University of Barcelona. That's where this image comes from. Just the citation I wanted to read. I know it's on there on the screen, but so if its body grows, the legs must be larger to hold the entire weight. I agree. Or if each body part has a specific growth rate, allometry, it would be the same with wings. If a dragonfly became as big as a golden eagle, it would have wings of several meters. Yeah. We had pretty big dragonflies or griffinflies, the relatives of the dragonflies in the past. Nothing as big as a golden eagle, but definitely as big as some of the larger birds that we have today. So if its body grows, their legs must be larger to hold the entire weight of its body. Each body part has a specific growth rate, allometry. Oh, we already read that, sorry. But there is a problem. Body parts don't grow to the infinite because they have anatomic and genetic constraints which modulate the size of each organ proportionally to the rest of the organism in a harmonic way. This drives us to talk about the existence of trade-off. It is not possible to reach optimal states of something without the detrimental of the states of something else. Without the detriment, maybe is what they meant? Okay. For this reason, the body will optimize its global growth in order to make the whole organism to work correctly. Thus, all things explained above will prevent the ant from being as big as an elephant. Yeah. Okay. Giant arthropods equals a delicacy for predators. Although it seems illogical, giant arthropods would probably be more vulnerable against predators, specifically during molt, because their body is soft. After molting their cuticles, arthropods go through a low activity period until their cuticle is totally hardened. In this lapse, they could be more easily predated. Apparently, the cuticle would imply more disadvantage than benefits in large insects. That's true. A way around that might be to shed or to molt a portion, one portion at a time, something like that. Physiological constraints and blood flow, and the problem with atmospheric oxygen. This is I didn't read this all through. I kind of scanned through it and looked at the visuals they have here on the different charts and stuff, because I think that's important to what we're talking about. Arthropods have an open circulatory system. Instead of having arteries and veins to channel their blood, arthropods possess open sinus where blood bathes the organ directly. Right, and it collects, he might get into this, it collects oxygen basically by sloshing against the spiracles. In which way does this imply a constraint for giant insects? While there is no active mechanism that pumps the blood throughout the body, it would be very difficult for giant insects to oxygenate and nourish all its cells due to the gravity effect. On the other side, most insects breathe passively through their spiracles, which connect with the internal system of branched conducts called trachea. Thus, they don't develop an active system to force air to enter the inside of the body, but it enters passively through these trachea. The rest of the inner arthropod's body is oxygenated cells. I've seen insects pumping oxygen through their spiracles, though I don't know if I agree with that. Diffusion of gases is effective over small distances, but not over large ones. So giant insects would face serious problems to oxygenate their tissue if they reached big sizes. In addition, current atmospheric concentration, the oxygen is 21%, wouldn't be enough to oxygenate such a big organism with such a simple breathing mechanism. Which is true. That's the current model. It must be said that all of these constraints are attenuated in aquatic ecosystems, where the cuticle's weight and diffusion of oxygen pose no problem for growth. That explains why the world's biggest arthropods and other invertebrates are mainly located in aquatic ecosystems, which I've already went over earlier in this topic. Giant prehistoric insects. Why did they disappear? According to the fossil record, insects reached their biggest sizes 300 million years ago, between the late Carboniferous and the early Permian. One of the most famous examples of giant prehistoric insects is Meganeura moni, a dragonfly that would have reached 70 centimeters long. So yeah, the one that's about the size of a crow. But the question is, why did they disappear? Paleoclimate data shows that the concentration of atmospheric oxygen was by then up to 30%. So it would be oxygen enough for the maintenance of insects' tissue. Some millions of years later, the concentration of oxygen decreased gradually until reaching the current concentration of 21%. And it's considered that this phenomenon could be correlated with the decrease in insect size. The rising of birds between the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous, atmospheric oxygen progressively increased, but the fossil records show no evidence of any increase in tendencies in insect size. Instead, they grew smaller. How could we explain this? According to the more recent hypothesis, this period coincided with the appearance of the first birds, which probably fed on big insects. So it is suggested that they took place that it took place a positive selection in favor of small insects. But not only birds, bats, and also other predators could have contributed to the selection of insects. However, the lack of a complete fossil record makes it difficult to confirm this hypothesis. So birds do eat insects, but I think that we probably saw more than just birds, just little dinosaurs in general, little archosaurs, and early mammals, synapsids, diapsids, have been eating insects for quite a long time, including your ancestors, because yes, we do have an ancestor in our human lineage that was an insectivore, much like Tarsier that we see today. So keep that in mind too. I don't know if they decided that it was an obligate insectivore, but it was definitely an insectivore. The most probable scenario is that a combination of ecological and environmental factors would have determined the body size of insects. Yes, always and forever. The existence of giant insects is part real and part fiction. For many of you, it will be a relief that the existence of insects as big as elephants is almost an impossible fact, but for the rest of you, it'll always have sci-fi. All right, so we got that. Here I was just looking at different things about the arthropod's exoskeleton and the size constraints that might come into play. Because biomineralization is going to create a heavy burden for these organisms to have to molt off as arthropods become larger in size, and we see this with crustaceans that get really big, like lobsters. Each molt that they have after they reach a certain size is potentially their death, because at some point or another the exoskeleton is going to be too thick, too strong for them to molt it off properly, and their squishy little inside is going to be trapped inside a coffin of their own dead shell, and they're going to suffocate and die within it. That does happen to very old arthropods as they grow, especially in marine environments. I don't know, like they said here, in marine environments, there's a lot of different factors that come into play as to why they continue to grow. Some insects, for the most part, have and not all of them, but for the most part, have a set number of molts, and then once they complete that cycle, they die. But crustaceans and scorpions and things like, and megalomorphic spiders, they don't necessarily have as much constraint on how many molts they're going to have, and they just eventually get stuck in a molt and die. So very common occurrence. Biomineralization is how the exoskeleton hardens after the molt. This also becomes a huge issue because the bigger the organism is, the thicker the exoskeleton is, the longer biomineralization takes. Biomineralization, I think maybe we've seen this in the hive. I know I've seen it in the hive, but I don't know if I've shared it or not. But after one of my organisms molt, whether my mantises or one of my spiders, you leave them alone for a few days for the spiders. But for the mantises, you just leave them alone for a few hours, because the spiders have a thicker, heavier exoskeleton that takes longer to biomineralize. So they need days, whereas the mantis just needs a couple hours. The problem with that is that we see in mantises and other insects is that if they don't molt and get that exoskeleton off and get into the position that they need to for biomineralization, because they have to stand a certain way and assume a certain position while the biomineralization takes place. If they can't get into that before that hardening process starts, they end up all bent and twisted and generally non-viable. If it's in their abdomen or in their cephalothorax or cephalorthorax, the limbs, if they have a bad molt where they can't get their limbs into position, it's not always such a big problem. Of course, it's situational, so that's going to depend. But the same thing can happen to these other organisms that take longer to biomineralize. So keeping that in mind, once we got so big, we'd see a lot of mangled-looking giant arthropods if we had that. All right, what else do we have here? Yeah, that was just a Reddit feed that I was going through for links. Blowing up real beetles. It's not part one. Where was part one? Okay. talking about speculative biology here. I was going to read this, but I think I'm probably running out of time. I probably need to be wrapping up here. But we might do like a part 2 on this because I let everything else run long, and HiveScience kind of always suffers from that. But usually I only plan on doing like a 10-minute HiveScience because I know some of these topics can get a little boring if we delve into them too much. So let me go ahead and just wrap up here. We might, again, revisit this topic at another point, maybe with a guest. And let's see here. All right, I'm going through the side chat real quick before I wrap up. Bugs aren't small, they're tiny. Actually, coconut crabs might be big enough to be small. Coconut crabs are big enough to be small. I like that ring. Yeah, gators can get about 13 feet long on average, so probably a bit big for comparison. Right, yeah, I think like a smaller caiman species maybe, or Chinese alligator, but Chinese alligators might actually be too small because I think they only get about 1.5 meters. They might get a little bigger than that, though. I might be wrong about that. Coconut crabs are big enough to be considered small. Got to get back to the farm. Temps today in the 80s. When it gets over 75, then, well, it's time to satisfy my thirst. Peace and love, y'all, and have a happy weekend. See ya, John Hudson. I want dome fried chicken now. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me live from the Hive today. Happy that had such a good turnout and you all were all engaging, and it was really fun to go over these topics with you. So what is a chronospecies? It is the direct documentation of a single lineage as it moves through the physiological transition from one species to another. This is perhaps best punctuated by trilobites. Due to their calcium carbonate carapaces, they leave a rather robust fossil record that documents the changes of each successive generation over a long period of transition, sometimes over hundreds of thousands or even millions of years. Throughout this timescale, we can actually see the retention of a population moving vertically through the geological column. As one species becomes another species, we see each generation changing up through the column until we have a new species at the top. All documented and recorded in the geological column. While trilobites might be the most prolific and perhaps even the quintessential example of a chronospecies, my personal favorite are the megatooth sharks. And the geological column beneath the Chesapeake Bay yields such a stable population of Carcharocles sharks that we can witness the slow temporal transition from Carcharocles cubanitensis to Carcharocles megalodon embedded right into the sedimentary layers. Chronospecies aren't just long ago and far away either, Kent. However, a great example of extant chronospecies is the bison. Now we see in the later half of the Pleistocene, we see B. priscus migrating across the Bering Strait and radiating throughout North America into multiple species, including longhorn bison and the modern American bison that we see today, the 2 species of American bison. We have that documented through successive generations of change from one species to another. This isn't theoretical. This isn't guesswork. We aren't filling in the blanks with anything. The bones are there. The bones are there. The geological column of the bones is there for all of these chronospecies. So yes, the geological column is very much a real thing, and chronospecies proves it.